Hey friends, welcome back to the Untold story. Tonight, we leave behind the crowded streets, the flashing lights, and the restless heartbeat of New York City, and drift towards something that has been watching over it for more than a century. The wind is cool here, out on the water. Beneath the murmur of waves and the distant hum of ferries, there's a shadow against the sky, tall, unmoving, as if time itself has forgotten her. We all know her name, and yet, we don't. The Statue of Liberty is more than copper and steel. She is a mask, and behind her eyes lies a history that was never meant for schoolbooks or tourist guides. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the smell of salt and rust, the taste of rain in the air, and the way gulls circle in slow, hungry spirals. 100 stories have landed on this harbor. Stories of hope, exile, ambition, and betrayal, and she has heard them all. Tonight, we'll slip between those stories and find the ones no one ever told you. Before she was a symbol of freedom, she was a bargain. Before she was a gift, she was a secret. And before she was lifted high above the waves, she stood in the shadows of politics, pride, and quiet rebellion. This is not just a statue. This is a witness. Birth of a symbol, conception, creation, and the hidden agenda. The sea was restless that morning, its surface flecked with white where waves curled and broke under a pale autumn sky. Beyond the grey horizon, the ships came and went, their sails and smokestacks drawing slow, deliberate arcs across the harbor. It is here, on this stretch of water where the Atlantic greets the Hudson, that the silhouette of a woman would one day rise, an icon recognized by millions, yet truly understood by so few. Most people, when they look at the Statue of Liberty, see the same thing: hope, freedom, a welcome to the tired, the poor, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. But what they don't see, what almost no one ever talks about, is that the statue's birth was not only an act of generosity, nor simply a friendship between France and America. It was also an intricate dance of politics, ego, financial desperation, and quiet agendas written not in the official record, but in the private letters and whispered conversations of the men who built her. The idea began, officially, in the mind of a French legal scholar named Edouard René de Laboulaye. In the years after the American Civil War, he dreamed of a monument that would honor the principles of liberty both nations claimed to cherish. On paper, it sounded pure, a gift from France to America, celebrating democracy. But beneath that noble language lay a tangle of motives. France was reeling from political instability, its empire shrinking, its people questioning the very idea of a republic. For Laboulaye, celebrating America was a way to shame his own country's monarchy and rally support for a French republic. The statue was, in part, a weapon, not of war, but of symbolism. And then there was Frederick Auguste Bartholdi, the ambitious sculptor who took the idea and turned it into stone, metal, and myth. Bartholdi was a man of vision, but also of calculation. He had dreamed for years of building a colossal statue, originally imagining it for the entrance of the Suez Canal in Egypt, a robed woman holding a torch, a beacon for the East. That plan collapsed, but the dream never left him. When Laboulaye's concept emerged, Bartholdi saw his chance. Liberty in America would be the project of his lifetime, and perhaps the salvation of his struggling career. The creation of the statue was far from the simple, romantic tale told in schoolbooks. Financing was a nightmare. In France, public enthusiasm was lukewarm. In America, it was nearly non-existent. Many Americans didn't see the point of spending money on a French statue when their own cities were drowning in poverty, corruption, and overcrowding. Newspapers mocked the idea. Fundraising dinners sputtered. There were nights when Bartholdi sat at his desk, staring at unfinished sketches, wondering if the statue would ever rise. Yet in these struggles, there were strange alliances. French Republicans used the statue as propaganda. American industrialists saw it as a chance to promote their ports and cities. Even Joseph Pulitzer, the newspaper magnate, inserted himself into the project, launching a fundraising campaign in his paper The New York World, not out of pure love for liberty, but because it sold papers and boosted his influence. As the statue took shape in Paris, whispers began about her face and form. Who was she, really? Bartholdi claimed the model was anonymous, an idealized figure of liberty herself. But stories leaked. Some said her features were based on his mother. Others claimed she resembled a woman from his past, perhaps a lover, perhaps a muse. The truth was never confirmed, but in every copper curve of her cheeks, in the solemn line of her mouth, there is something personal, something human, that no political speech could explain. The torch, too, carried a double meaning. Officially, It was the light of liberty guiding ships into harbor. Unofficially, it was a nod to Bartholdi's earlier Egyptian design, a direct echo of his unrealized dream for the Suez Canal. The statue's very construction, designed in pieces, assembled like a puzzle, mirrored the fractured alliances and quiet compromises that had brought her into existence. When she was finally shipped to America in 350 individual pieces, packed into wooden crates, she was more than a gift. She was a gamble. Would the Americans embrace her? Would the politics fade and the poetry take hold? Or would she stand in the harbor as a hollow symbol, beautiful but ignored? Even at her dedication in 1886, the crowds cheered, but there were critics in the shadows, muttering about waste, about foreign influence, about the inconvenient truths her copper skin concealed. And so, the Statue of Liberty rose, not as a flawless beacon, but as a living paradox. She was at once a gift and a plea, a celebration and a rebuke, a dream born of both hope and calculation. Those who see her from the decks of incoming ships feel the promise she was meant to embody. Those who know her full story understand that the truth, like the statue herself, is layered, copper over iron, beauty over politics, symbol over secret. What history books rarely say is that from the very beginning, she was not just liberty. She was a message. And messages, especially the kind forged in metal and myth, are never as simple as they seem. Hidden messages in the copper skin. From a distance, the Statue of Liberty is a single, seamless figure, tall, proud, draped in timeless robes, torch lifted to the sky. But anyone who has ever stood close enough to see the seams, the rivets, the faint ripples in the copper knows, she is not one continuous piece. She is a mosaic. And like any mosaic, she is built of fragments, each with its own story. When the statue first arrived in America, her copper skin shone like a newly minted coin, a brilliant reddish gold that caught the sunlight and seemed to glow. This is a detail many modern visitors don't realize. They think she has always been green. But the green patina came later, the result of decades of exposure to sea air, salt, and rain. That transformation was more than chemistry. It was symbolism in slow motion. She began as a radiant promise, then weathered into something older, quieter, more enduring, a survivor of storms both literal and political. But look closer, and you might notice something stranger. Subtle variations in texture, tiny irregularities in the metal, almost like scars. To most observers, these are just the marks of handcrafting. Yet in certain circles, there are those who believe these imperfections are intentional. Symbols etched into the statue's surface by the artisans who built her, hidden in plain sight. Frederick August Bartholdi was not just a sculptor. He was a man steeped in the iconography of the 19th century. Allegories, Masonic symbolism, coded references understood only by the initiated. Several members of the team who worked on the statue, including her structural engineer Gustav Eiffel, were connected to the Freemasons, a fraternal order famous for embedding hidden meanings in architecture. To them, liberty was more than a political statement. She was a guardian of enlightenment, a physical embodiment of the light of knowledge triumphing over the darkness of ignorance. Some researchers have pointed to the statue's 7-point crown as one such code. Officially, the spikes represent the 7 seas and 7 continents, a universal welcome. But in Masonic tradition, the number 7 has deeper connotations: perfection, completion, a bridge between the earthly and the divine. The crown becomes not just a geographical symbol, but a spiritual one, linking the physical world to higher ideals. Others have focused on the tablet in her left hand, inscribed with the date July 4, 1776, in Roman numerals. It is the most visible connection to American independence. Yet, the proportions of the tablet, its shape, and the way she grips it have been compared to ancient depictions of the Book of Law, an object in both Masonic and classical imagery representing the knowledge that governs just societies. Whether coincidence or design, the resonance is uncanny. Then there is the matter of her feet, something most tourists never see clearly. Beneath the folds of a robe, her right foot is raised, mid-step, breaking free from a broken shackle and chain. The chain lies partly hidden by the drapery, visible only from certain angles. This detail was not accidental. In the earliest sketches, the broken shackles were far more prominent, meant to symbolize the abolition of slavery in America. But political sensitivities at the time, especially in the post-Civil War era, led to a subtler presentation. The message remained, but it was quiet, almost secret, visible only to those who knew to look for it. And here is where the whispers begin. Was liberty truly a gift from France to America? Or was she a monument carrying layered messages, some for the public, some for the powerful, and some for a select few whose loyalties were not bound by national borders? In the Paris workshop where the statue's copper plates were hammered into shape, workers sometimes scratched their initials or small symbols onto the interior surfaces. Most of these marks are lost to time, but during restorations in the 1980s, teams found strange patterns etched into some inner panels: triangles, compasses, stylized suns. Were they just idle doodles by tired craftsmen? Or signatures of a brotherhood claiming silent ownership of the statue's soul? The torch itself, replaced in the 1980s with a new design, was once accessible to visitors. Standing there, one could look out over the harbor, the city shimmering beyond, and feel as if holding the very flame of civilization. But to certain historians, the torch was also a reference to the illuminating eye of enlightenment, a beacon not just for immigrants but for the idea of a world guided by reason and knowledge. Whether this was Bartholdi's conscious intent or the result of layered interpretations over time is impossible to prove. But the symbolism clings to her, decade after decade. Even her face invites speculation. To the casual viewer, she is serene, solemn, timeless. But to those who study such things, there is a hint of melancholy in her eyes, as if she knows the promises she represents are not always kept. If Bartholdi modeled her partly after his mother, then the statue's expression might carry a personal weight, an unspoken story of endurance, loss, or resilience. In the end, the hidden messages in the Statue of Liberty may be less about secret societies or conspiracies and more about the human urge to embed meaning into the things we build. We cannot help but leave traces of ourselves, our beliefs, our hopes, our warnings, in the monuments we raise. And perhaps that is why Liberty feels so alive, even after more than a century. She is not just copper and steel, but a palimpsest of intentions, a layered manuscript in metal, open to anyone patient enough to read her. The next time you stand before her, try to see beyond the postcard image. Look for the seams. Look for the scars. Look for the messages hidden in the folds of her robe, the tilt of her crown, the lift of her torch. You may not find answers, but you will see her, truly see her, in a way few people ever do. The funding war, America's reluctance and France's pride. If you close your eyes and picture the Statue of Liberty's arrival in America, you might imagine it as a seamless tale of friendship, a gift from the French people to their American brothers, warmly received, proudly raised, celebrated by all. But reality rarely aligns with the romantic version we tell in history books. The truth is that bringing Lady Liberty to life was not just a feat of engineering. It was a battle of money, pride, and political stubbornness that nearly killed the project before it began. The idea for the statue was born in France in the late 1860s, at the dining table of Edouard René de Laboulaye, a French jurist and abolitionist who admired the American experiment in democracy. He proposed that France should give America a monument to commemorate their alliance during the American Revolution and to celebrate the centennial of US independence in 1876. It was an ambitious, noble idea, and a strategically political one. France, still reeling from the disastrous Franco-Prussian War and struggling with internal instability, could benefit from tying its image to the great democratic beacon across the Atlantic. Bartholdi, the sculptor chosen for the project, embraced the vision with the fervor of a man who saw not just a monument, but a legacy. He poured years into designing Liberty, envisioning her rising in New York Harbor as a signal to the world. France would pay for the statue itself, and America would fund the pedestal on which she stood. Simple enough, on paper. But paper does not account for politics. When Bartholdi arrived in New York in 1871 to pitch his grand idea, he expected enthusiasm. Instead, he found cold practicality. The city had other priorities: infrastructure, sanitation, a growing population of immigrants, rising crime. A massive pedestal for a foreign-made statue was far down the list. Newspapers questioned the value of the project. Politicians shrugged. Some openly mocked it. Why should New Yorkers, or anyone in America, pay for the base of a gift they never asked for? Fundraising began, haltingly, in the early 1880s. Wealthy patrons were approached, but many hesitated. This was the Gilded Age, a time of staggering fortunes and equally staggering greed. Industrialists like Rockefeller and Vanderbilt were not in the habit of donating to causes unless there was a clear return, political or financial. To them, a pedestal was just an expensive piece of stone. Meanwhile, France surged ahead. By 1884, Liberty was complete, a towering, disassembled giant in Paris, awaiting her voyage. The French public had rallied behind her, holding concerts, banquets, and auctions to fund the work. Even schoolchildren contributed coins. For them, liberty was not just for America. She was a statement to the world that France still stood for ideals of freedom and enlightenment, even as her own political system wavered. In America, the contrast was embarrassing. Construction on the pedestal had barely begun, and funds were dwindling. The press began to speculate whether the French gift might end up stored indefinitely, or worse, shipped to another country more appreciative of the gesture. Rumors swirled of offers from cities like Boston and Philadelphia, eager to claim the statue for themselves if New York would not step up. And then came Joseph Pulitzer. Pulitzer, a Hungarian immigrant and owner of the New York World newspaper, saw both a civic duty and a business opportunity. He launched a campaign on his front page, appealing not to the wealthy elite but to the working people of America, the same people who would pass beneath liberty's gaze when they arrived in New York Harbor. His call was simple. Every contributor, no matter how small the amount, would have their name printed in the paper. It was a radical move. In a matter of months, more than 120,000 people had donated, many giving only a few cents. Children sent in their savings. Dockworkers handed over coins from their day's pay. One donor simply signed their contribution, a young girl alone in the world. The names filled the pages of the New York World, turning the pedestal into a monument funded by the people themselves, not the politicians, not the tycoons. France watched with a mix of pride and impatience. Their colossal creation had been sitting in crates for months, stored in a Paris warehouse, awaiting shipment. Every delay risked the copper skin warping or the structure suffering damage. Bartholdi, anxious and determined, pushed American officials harder. "She must be raised," he wrote in one letter, "for the eyes of the world are upon us both." Finally, in 1885, the last funds were secured. The pedestal rose from the stone of Bedloe's Island, a stark, blocky foundation designed by American architect Richard Morris Hunt. By the time the statue's pieces arrived in New York, the mood had shifted. Public excitement swelled. Crowds gathered to watch the reassembly. Workers riveted copper plates into place like surgeons piecing together a giant. But beneath the celebration lingered an unspoken truth. Liberty was not born of pure, unshakable unity. She was the product of negotiation, stubbornness, and a transatlantic tug-of-war over money and meaning. France had given her shape, but America had been reluctant to give her a home. It is a strange irony. The world's most famous symbol of welcome was almost kept out by financial hesitation. Perhaps that, too, is part of her story. Liberty has always been an ideal more easily admired than fully funded. She arrived not because the road was smooth, but because enough people, ordinary, working people, decided she was worth fighting for. And maybe that's the most fitting origin of all. The hidden engineering of Gustave Eiffel. When people look at the Statue of Liberty, their eyes rise to her torch, her crown, her flowing robe, the artistry of Bartholdi's hand. But the truth is, none of those details would matter if she couldn't stand. And she stands because of a man who is often overlooked in this story, Gustave Eiffel. Yes, that Eiffel. The same man who would later design the Eiffel Tower. But before his iron lattice pierced the Parisian skyline, Eiffel was called into a very different challenge. One that involved not a tower reaching for the clouds, but a woman standing steadfast in the violent winds of New York Harbor. In the early 1880s, Bartholdi had completed the statue's exterior design. She was to be colossal, taller than any monument the modern world had seen, but made entirely of thin copper sheets, no thicker than 2 pennies stacked together. A giant of metal, yet hollow, delicate, and light enough to ship across the Atlantic. The problem was obvious. How could something so thin survive the gales of the harbor, the freezing winters, the sweltering summers, and the constant shifting of the earth beneath her feet? Traditional stone monuments relied on sheer weight for stability. The pyramids in Egypt, the columns of ancient Greece. But Liberty could not be solid. She had to be assembled in pieces, raised high, and yet flexible enough to move without breaking. For this, Bartholdi needed an engineer who understood not just strength, but motion. Enter Eiffel. When he examined Bartholdi's drawings, Eiffel understood immediately that the statue's skeleton could not be rigid. If she were too stiff, the copper skin would crack under temperature changes. If she were too loose, she would sway dangerously in the wind. The answer was an internal support unlike anything ever built before, a tower within a woman. Eiffel designed a 4-legged wrought iron pylon at the statue's core, rising up from the pedestal to her shoulders. From this central spine, a series of horizontal and diagonal girders extended outward like the ribs of a ship, connecting to a secondary framework of steel bars. These bars would hold the copper plates in place, but, and here was the genius, they would not be bolted tight. Instead, Eiffel used a system of flexible armatures, allowing the copper skin to expand and contract with heat, to bend slightly in storms, and yet always return to its form. It was a marriage of art and science so advanced that, at the time, few people even understood it. Eiffel was designing for forces that most 19th century builders didn't bother to calculate: wind load, thermal expansion, torsional stress. He built Liberty to move. On a blustery day, her torch can sway by as much as 5 inches. In extreme winds, her crown shifts slightly from side to side. To the naked eye, she appears immovable, but inside, she is a living structure, breathing with the weather. And yet, Eiffel's brilliance wasn't just mechanical. There was subtle symbolism in his work. The iron pylon inside Liberty is shaped like a narrow, tapering column, almost like a tree trunk, with beams branching outward. Eiffel once remarked to a colleague that he thought of the statue as a tree of liberty rooted in the pedestal. Whether he meant it poetically or not, the metaphor fit perfectly. But there's another secret few talk about. The skeleton Eiffel built was not designed to last forever. The iron framework relied on an insulating material, shellac-coated asbestos, to prevent the copper from reacting with the iron, which would cause galvanic corrosion. Eiffel likely knew the insulation might degrade after decades, but in the 1880s, no one imagined the statue would stand unaltered for over a century. They built her for permanence as they understood it, which meant, in truth, for about 100 years. This hidden vulnerability wouldn't be discovered until the 1980s, during the massive restoration for Liberty Centennial. By then, the original insulation had disintegrated in many places, and iron beams were rusting dangerously close to the copper skin. Engineers who stepped inside her in those years spoke of a strange feeling, as if they were looking at the skeleton of a myth, fragile and mortal. Still, Eiffel's design had done its job beyond expectation. Through blizzards, hurricanes, and decades of corrosive sea air, Lady Liberty had remained upright, her copper face calm against the chaos of the world. When the statue was first assembled in Paris for testing in 1884, Eiffel stood quietly among the crowd, watching her rise. Reporters focused on Bartholdi, the sculptor. Politicians made speeches. But Eiffel stayed in the background, his name not yet the brand it would become. Perhaps that was fitting. His genius was invisible, hidden in the shadows of a robe, in the iron bones no tourist would ever see. And maybe that's the real beauty of it. A monument meant to symbolize freedom and resilience stands not because of the glory on her surface, but because of the unseen strength inside her, the quiet brilliance of an engineer who understood that even the mightiest cymbal must be able to bend before it can truly endure. Whispers of the workshop, crafting a colossus. The year was 1875, and the air inside the Gaget, Gauthier and Company workshop in Paris was thick with the mingled scents of metal shavings, hot tar, and oil lamps burning well past midnight. In this cramped yet sacred space, one of the most ambitious sculptures in modern history was slowly coming to life. Not as a seamless statue, but as a jigsaw of copper plates, each one no thicker than a coin yet destined to stand against storms, salt, and centuries. This was not the polished, majestic Lady Liberty we know today. Here, she was fragmented, her arm lying in one corner of the workshop, her giant head dominating another, her crown resting awkwardly on the floor like the discarded trinket of a giant. The workmen moved among her dismembered parts like ants carrying pieces of some impossible prey. Sparks lit the air when copper met hammer, echoing in a rhythm that seemed less like construction and more like the steady heartbeat of a living thing being assembled. At the heart of this creation was Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi, the French sculptor whose mind carried both the vision and the burden of this colossal project. His sketches lined the walls, some smudged by sweat or by the accidental brush of a gloved hand. He knew that every curve mattered, not just for beauty, but for stability. One wrong calculation and the dream of a monument to freedom could collapse under its own weight. Yet behind Bartholdi's confident posture, whispers floated. This project was not purely a gift of goodwill from France to America, as the newspapers claimed. There were debts owed, both personal and political, and the statue's construction offered a convenient cover for moving certain sums of money in ways that the public would never suspect. Certain industrialists, eager for contracts, found their influence stretching deep into the folds of the statue's copper skin. In every rivet and brace, there were stories of backroom deals and discreet exchanges in shadowed Parisian cafes. Meanwhile, the workers, mostly immigrants and apprentices, labored for meager wages, some unaware of the full scale of what they were building. For them, it was simply work, cutting sheets, shaping them over massive wooden molds, or clambering up scaffolds to hammer the plates into place. The method used, repousse, shaping metal from the inside, was an ancient technique, but here it was being pushed to limits never before attempted. Every clang of the hammer was a gamble. The copper had to bend without breaking, each piece fitting together with near mathematical precision when the time came to assemble her in New York Harbor. And then there was the engineer, Gustave Eiffel, already a rising name, though his tower had yet to rise in Paris. It was his genius that allowed the statue to stand. Inside the copper shell would be a skeletal framework of iron, flexible enough to sway in the wind, yet strong enough to hold firm against hurricanes. Eiffel's calculations were meticulous, yet even he worried about how the salty Atlantic air might gnaw at the metal over decades. To protect it, they devised a gap between the copper skin and the iron armature, allowing the statue to breathe, to expand and contract with temperature changes like a living organism. But not every decision was made for purely technical reasons. In certain private meetings, design adjustments were discussed not for structural integrity but for symbolism. A certain set of chains, originally meant to be more prominent at Liberty's feet, were reduced to a smaller, less visible detail. Some feared the imagery might provoke political tensions in the United States, where wounds from the Civil War were still fresh. Others argued that too obvious a message about slavery might alienate parts of the American public whose donations were needed to build the pedestal. Bartholdi wrestled with these compromises. He saw the statue not merely as a work of art but as a statement, yet he knew that too bold a statement could jeopardize its completion. So he accepted the subtler imagery, a broken shackle half hidden beneath Liberty's flowing robes, visible only to those who looked closely. In this way, the statue held a secret, its silent testimony to struggles not yet finished. Meanwhile, the workshops became a place of myth. Visitors who managed to gain access spoke in or of the colossal face staring down at them, its calm expression somehow both reassuring and unsettling. "It's as if she knows more than she can say," one journalist wrote. Yet those who worked within the shop felt the pressure of time. The Americans were waiting, the French press was watching, and funding, always funding, was a source of tension. When money ran low, progress slowed to a crawl, and the workers were sent home to wait for orders to resume. It was during one such lull that an unmarked crate arrived at the workshop. Its contents were never officially recorded, but whispers claimed it contained a gift from a wealthy patron with connections in both Paris and New York, an item of symbolic importance that would be hidden within the statue itself. Whether it was a document, a personal relic, or something else entirely, only a handful of people knew for certain. If the rumors were true, then somewhere inside the Statue of Liberty, encased in copper and iron, rests a secret artifact from the days of her creation, a time capsule never meant to be opened. When construction finally resumed, the pace became relentless. The head was completed in 1878 and displayed at the Paris World's Fair, drawing massive crowds. For many visitors, it was their first glimpse of what was to come, a tantalizing fragment of a dream. But for the workers, it was simply another piece in a puzzle that would take years to finish. Each day brought new challenges: a misaligned seam, a shipment of copper delayed, a scaffold collapsing in the rain. Injuries were not uncommon, and though none were officially reported as fatal, there were hushed conversations about a man who had fallen from a shoulder section, his body quietly removed before dawn. As the final plates were hammered into shape, Bartholdi knew that the statue's physical form was almost complete. Yet the real work, the assembly in New York, was still ahead. In the shadows of the workshop, the Lady of Liberty stood in pieces, her silent gaze waiting for the moment she would be reassembled and raised high above the waters. Few could have guessed then how many secrets were already hidden within her copper skin, how many compromises had shaped her form, and how many stories would remain locked away as long as she stood. She was more than art. She was more than a gift. She was a riddle cast in metal, a monument whose true history was as fragmented as the pieces that once lay scattered on the workshop floor. And in the years to come, those secrets would cross the ocean with her, bound for a harbor where freedom's light would shine, but only for those who chose to see it in full. Crossing the Atlantic, the voyage of a giant. By the spring of 1885, the Statue of Liberty was no longer merely an idea or a scattering of dismembered copper parts in a Parisian workshop. She was a completed figure, fully formed but separated into hundreds of precisely crafted pieces, awaiting her journey to the land that would become her permanent home. The task ahead was no less daunting than the years of construction that had preceded it, transporting a colossal monument, without damage, across an ocean notorious for swallowing ships whole. The Gaggett, Gauthier and Company workshop had transformed into something resembling a shipyard in the days leading up to departure. Workers carefully labelled each component, 350 individual pieces, packed into 214 wooden crates. Each crate bore stenciled numbers and symbols, part of a complex system designed so that the statue could be reassembled with absolute accuracy once it reached New York Harbor. These weren't just simple boxes. Some were the size of small houses, their thick planks reinforced with metal bands to withstand the violent rocking of the Atlantic. Inside, every curve of copper was wrapped in layers of straw, canvas, and tarred cloth to keep out moisture. The logistics alone were staggering. Even the statue's torch, just one section of her design, was a massive structure, its flame spanning several meters. The face alone filled an entire crate, its serene expression hidden behind thick boards. To onlookers, the crates might have appeared unremarkable, but to those who knew what lay inside, each one was like a sealed vault holding a fragment of an icon. The French government had arranged for the French Navy to oversee part of the process, but the actual transportation fell to a commercial steamship, the Isery. Sleek and sturdy, the Isery had seen years of service, but never had it carried such an unusual and precious cargo. Her captain, seasoned and unflappable, was given strict orders. The crates must arrive intact, no matter the cost. But there was a quiet acknowledgement among the crew. The Atlantic was an unpredictable adversary, and even the best ship could find herself at the mercy of storms. Before departure, a small ceremony was held at the dock. Bartholdi himself stood among the gathered officials and labourists, his eyes scanning the crates as if committing their placement to memory. Gustave Eiffel was present as well, his calm demeanor belying the fact that he had calculated every tolerance of the statue's frame with near-obsessive precision. The speeches were polite and brief, the applause measured. Yet behind the public smiles, there was tension. Delays in fundraising for the statue's pedestal in New York meant that the pieces might arrive long before there was a base to support them. The Americans were struggling to rally the funds, and there were whispers that the crates might languish in storage for months, or even years. When the Isery finally pulled away from the dock, her black smokestacks trailing plumes against the pale sky, a cheer went up from the small crowd. It was a cheer laced with hope, pride, and a quiet uncertainty. For the workers who had spent years hammering copper into shape, it was a bittersweet moment. Their lady was leaving them forever. The first days at sea were calm, the ship cutting through glassy waters under a mild spring sun. The crew took turns standing watch over the statue's crates, checking that the ropes and lashings remained secure. They joked about the peculiar cargo, how odd it was to carry a giant woman across the ocean in boxes. But soon, the weather began to change. On the fourth night, heavy swells rolled in from the northwest, and the Isery began to pitch and heave. The cargo hold groaned under the strain. Barrels shifted, ropes strained, and the smell of damp wood and salt began to fill the lower decks. The captain ordered additional bracing for the largest crates, sending men below to hammer in wedges and drive iron nails deep into the floorboards. They worked in near darkness, their lanterns swinging wildly with each lurch of the ship. By the second week, the voyage had turned into a trial of endurance. Gale-force winds battered the Isery, driving rain into every crevice. Waves rose like walls, slamming against the hull with bone-shaking force. In the darkness, lightning illuminated the deck in brief, blinding flashes, jagged portraits of men clinging to rigging, seawater cascading over the bow. Below, the statue's copper skin creaked and shifted in her crates, as if impatient to be freed from her confinement. There were moments when the captain considered turning back, but the Isery pressed on, her engines laboring against the storm. To lose the cargo would have been more than a financial disaster. It would have been a symbolic blow to the friendship between France and the United States. Each man aboard knew this, and they fought the sea with a determination bordering on defiance. After nearly a month at sea, the storms broke. The waters calmed, and gulls began to appear on the horizon, a sure sign that land was near. On the morning of June 17, 1885, the Isery glided into New York Harbor, her hull streaked with salt, her crew exhausted but victorious. As she approached the dock, word spread through the city, and soon a crowd gathered along the waterfront to witness the arrival. It was a moment thick with symbolism. The crates, towering on the deck, seemed like mysterious totems from another world. New York's newspapers reported the event with enthusiasm, some describing the shipment as the arrival of liberty herself. Yet there was also a tinge of embarrassment. The pedestal on Bedloe's Island was still incomplete, and the statue could not be assembled until it was finished. For now, liberty would remain in pieces, stored away like a puzzle awaiting the right moment to be solved. But there were rumors that not all the crates were opened or inspected upon arrival. A few, it was said, bore no markings in the French records and were quietly moved to undisclosed locations. Whether these were simply mislabeled supplies or something more mysterious, no one could say for sure. For the people of New York, the arrival of the Isery was the promise of something grand, though still far in the future. For Bartholdi, who had traveled separately to oversee the final stages of the project, it was a bittersweet milestone. The lady had crossed the ocean, but her journey was far from over. She had survived the storms of the Atlantic, but greater challenges, political, financial, and even symbolic, still lay ahead before she could rise above the harbor and lift her torch to the sky. And somewhere, in the dark recesses of a warehouse on the waterfront, a handful of unassuming crates sat untouched, their contents known only to a select few. In those sealed boxes, perhaps, rested the final untold secrets of her voyage. The pedestal problem, a race against time. When the Isery docked in New York Harbor that June morning of 1885, the city skyline was a mix of masts, church steeples, and the emerging outlines of taller, steel-framed buildings. Yet among all these rising shapes, the most anticipated landmark, the Statue of Liberty, was still nothing more than an empty promise. Her copper skin rested in hundreds of crates, stacked in warehouses along the waterfront, silent and inert. She had crossed the ocean, but she had nowhere to stand. The truth was stark. Bedloe's Island, the chosen site for the statue, had only the bare beginnings of a pedestal. What existed there was little more than a deep pit, a skeletal framework of concrete and granite blocks, and a scattering of work tools rusting in the salt air. Fundraising for the pedestal had stalled months before the Isery even set sail, and the responsibility for building it had been left to the American side of the project, an obligation they had not yet fulfilled. The estimated cost for the pedestal alone was around $250,000, an enormous sum for the time, and with the US economy still recovering from financial downturns in the 1870s, enthusiasm among wealthy donors had cooled. The project was, in a sense, trapped in limbo. France had delivered the statue as promised, but the Americans had failed to prepare her foundation. Bartholdi, who had arrived shortly after the Isery, was a man torn between pride and frustration. He had given years of his life to this project, traveling across continents, charming politicians, inspiring workers, and pushing engineers to their limits. Now, in the streets of New York, he found himself explaining, again and again, to curious citizens why the Lady of Liberty could not yet take her place. His answers were polite, but privately, he was alarmed. The New York Times ran articles hinting that the crates might languish for years if public interest didn't revive. Worse still, some critics began to question the statue's value altogether, calling it a costly ornament at a time when the city faced pressing social issues, overcrowded tenements, rampant disease, and labor unrest. A few even suggested selling the copper for scrap to recoup the costs, a proposal that made Bartholdi bristle with fury. It was in this climate of uncertainty that Joseph Pulitzer entered the scene. The Hungarian-born newspaper magnate had recently taken control of the New York World, and he saw in the statue's plight an opportunity, not only to save the project, but to boost his paper's circulation. Pulitzer launched an aggressive campaign, calling on ordinary Americans to contribute whatever they could, no matter how small. His editorials were direct and emotionally charged. "Let us not wait for the millionaires to give this money," he wrote. "It is not a gift from the French to the millionaires of America, but to the people of America." The World published the names of every single donor, along with their contributions, whether they were businessmen giving $500 or schoolchildren donating pennies. The campaign struck a chord. Donations began to flow in from across the country, coins wrapped in scraps of paper, envelopes containing single-dollar bills, letters filled with words of pride and hope. Some contributors wrote about their immigrant journeys and how the statue would stand as a welcome to others like them. Within 5 months, Pulitzer's campaign had raised over $100,000, enough to restart the construction on Bedloe's Island. Meanwhile, work crews returned to the island with renewed vigor. The pedestal's design, crafted by American architect Richard Morris Hunt, was a massive, fortress-like structure of granite and concrete. Rising over 80 feet tall, it would give the statue the commanding presence needed to dominate the harbor. But building it was no simple task. Every stone had to be ferried to the island, lifted into place by cranes powered by steam engines, and set with meticulous precision. The construction site was a noisy, dangerous place. Workers labored in the heat of summer and the freezing winds of winter, their clothes caked in dust and sweat. The sound of chisels striking stone echoed across the water, mingling with the distant hum of the city. Accidents were inevitable. Stone slipped, rope snapped, and more than one man narrowly avoided being crushed beneath falling blocks. Yet through it all, the project pushed forward. Bartholdi visited the site often, pacing the scaffolding like a general inspecting his troops. He was relentless in his insistence on quality. If a stone was even slightly out of alignment, it was torn out and replaced. He knew that the pedestal was more than just a base. It was the foundation of a symbol meant to last for centuries. By early 1886, the pedestal began to take its final form. The great granite walls rose high above the island, their sheer surfaces gleaming in the winter sun. The interior chamber, which would one day house the museum and entryway, was taking shape. Above it, a massive platform was being prepared to receive the statue's iron framework. But even as the pedestal neared completion, another challenge loomed: how to reassemble the statue herself. The copper sheets had survived the voyage well enough, but each had to be reattached to Eiffel's iron skeleton with exacting precision. The task would require skilled workers, specialized equipment, and, above all, time. In the warehouses where the crates were stored, carpenters and metalworkers began the painstaking process of unpacking each piece. The giant face emerged first, its calm, unblinking eyes staring into the dim light. The torch was lifted out next, followed by massive folds of the robe, each larger than a wagon. As these parts were ferried to Bedloe's Island, onlookers gathered along the shore to watch, their curiosity reignited. There were whispers, though, about certain crates that still hadn't been opened. Some said they were miscatalogued. Others claimed they contained gifts from France, items unrelated to the statue but sent as tokens of friendship. A few dockworkers swore they saw small, ornate boxes being carried away under guard, their destinations unknown. By the spring of 1886, the pedestal was ready. Bartholdi stood on its broad platform, gazing out at the city, the rivers, and the distant sea. Soon, the lady would rise here, her torch visible for miles, a beacon for ships and for the countless immigrants who would pass beneath her gaze. Yet as he looked down at the crates that still awaited assembly, he felt the weight of the journey ahead. The hardest work, in many ways, was just beginning. And deep in his mind lingered one unsettling thought: if certain pieces were missing, or hidden, how could he ever be sure the statue would be whole? Assembly of a giant, the mystery of the missing pieces. The spring of 1886 was unusually damp in New York Harbor. Fog clung stubbornly to the water, rolling in from the Atlantic and curling around Bedloe's Island like a shroud. To most, it was just another season in the city, but to those laboring on the pedestal, it seemed a fitting backdrop for the work ahead, work that was as monumental as it was fraught with uncertainty. The pedestal was finally complete, a proud fortress of granite rising from the heart of the island. Its broad platform awaited the figure who would soon dominate the skyline, Liberty herself. Yet the woman of copper and steel lay scattered still, her form reduced to hundreds of panels, ribs, and beams. The challenge now was to transform this massive, intricate puzzle into the towering symbol that France had promised and America had dreamed of. The reassembly was entrusted to a team of experienced ironworkers and carpenters, many of whom had worked on the city's new suspension bridges and emerging skyscrapers. The statue's internal skeleton, designed by Alexandre Gustave Eiffel, was an engineering marvel in its own right, a network of wrought iron supports, crossbeams, and flexible trusses that would allow the copper skin to move slightly in the wind without tearing apart. Eiffel himself had sent detailed instructions with the statue shipment, diagrams that marked every joint, rivet, and beam. Yet when the foreman opened the crates, they quickly realized that something was wrong. Several key components were missing, not large enough to halt construction immediately, but important enough to raise concern. The first to vanish were small but specialized fittings, iron brackets custom forged in Paris to connect the copper sheets to the skeleton. At first, the crew assumed they had been misplaced in the confusion of unloading. But as days passed and more parts failed to turn up, the whispers began. Some blamed overworked dockhands who had lost track of the crates. Others suspected theft, pointing out that these fittings were made from a high-grade alloy valuable on the black market. Then there were the stranger rumors. An older laborer claimed he had seen two men in fine coats boarding a barge at night, carrying wooden boxes marked with the French shipping seal. They weren't workmen, he insisted, nor customs officials. Their faces were hidden under wide-brimmed hats, and they moved with the quiet efficiency of men who did not want to be noticed. Bartholdi was furious when he heard these accounts, but he ordered the work to proceed. Replacement parts could be fabricated in New York, though it would delay the schedule and strain the already tight budget. For him, the priority was to see the statue rise before the year's end. The process began with the iron skeleton. Work crews erected towering scaffolds around the pedestal, their wooden frames creaking under the weight of men and equipment. Beams were hoisted by steam-powered cranes, swung into place with precision, and fixed together with bolts and rivets. The skeleton rose in stages, each level braced before the next was begun. From a distance, it resembled the framework of some strange mechanical tower. Once the skeleton's lower structure was in place, the copper plates began to arrive. These were thin sheets, barely more than a few millimeters thick, but each was curved and shaped to form part of Liberty's flowing robes, her face, or her crown. Riveters and metalworkers clambered along the scaffolding, aligning the plates to the ribs, hammering them into place, and sealing the seams. Working at such heights was dangerous. The wind off the harbor could knock a man off balance in an instant. Several workers slipped and fell, saved only by the thick ropes tied around their waists. One man was not so lucky. His harness snapped, and he plunged into the cold waters below. His body was never recovered. Despite the setbacks, the statue began to take shape. By midsummer, her feet and lower robes were complete, the massive folds catching the shifting light. As the torso rose, Bartholdi spent more time on the island, overseeing every detail. He had an artist's obsession with form and proportion. A single misaligned plate could disrupt the entire illusion of movement in her robes. It was during the construction of the upper torso that the mystery deepened. A crate containing parts of the statue's right arm arrived with its seals broken. Inside, the main iron support beam for the torch was missing entirely. No one could explain how such a critical piece could vanish between France and New York without someone noticing. Frantic, Bartholdi sent word to Paris, asking if a duplicate could be shipped. The reply came weeks later. The beam had left France in perfect condition. There was no record of it being held in customs. It had simply disappeared. In the meantime, American blacksmiths worked around the clock to forge a replacement. They relied on Eiffel's original diagrams, but some suspected that subtle differences in the alloy or shaping might affect the torch stability in high winds. By early autumn, the head and crown were prepared for assembly. Crowds gathered along the Manhattan shoreline to watch as the giant face was hoisted skyward. Her calm expression seemed almost serene, even as she hung suspended over the harbor by a single chain. When the crown was fixed in place, its 7 rays gleamed in the afternoon sun, visible from miles away. Yet those working closest to her noticed something unusual: a small, shallow indentation at the base of the crown, hidden from any observer on the ground. It was not part of the original design. Some speculated it was damage from the voyage. Others thought it was the mark of a removed panel. But the location, near a structural joint, made no sense for such a panel to exist in the first place. By late October, the torch was finally raised into place, the last great piece of the statue's form. From her toes to the tip of the flame, she now stood over 300 feet above the water. The scaffolding still clung to her sides, but for the first time, New Yorkers could truly imagine what she would look like standing alone, watching over the harbor. Bartholdi was relieved but restless. The missing parts still gnawed at him, and the unexplained alterations to the crown left him uneasy. He had no proof, but he began to suspect that someone, either in France or in America, had tampered with his creation for reasons unknown. The dedication ceremony was set for October 28, 1886. The race to complete the final touches was on. Yet even as workers polished the copper, tightened the bolts, and removed the scaffolds, rumors persisted that certain interior spaces within the statue were not exactly as designed. And somewhere, perhaps in a warehouse, a private collection, or a vault, lay the original missing pieces of Liberty, waiting, perhaps, for the day when their secrets would be revealed. Assembly of a giant, the mystery of the missing pieces. The spring of 1886 was unusually damp in New York Harbor. Fog clung stubbornly to the water, rolling in from the Atlantic and curling around Bedloe's Island like a shroud. To most, it was just another season in the city, but to those laboring on the pedestal, it seemed a fitting backdrop for the work ahead, work that was as monumental as it was fraught with uncertainty. The pedestal was finally complete, a proud fortress of granite rising from the heart of the island. Its broad platform awaited the figure who would soon dominate the skyline, Liberty herself. Yet the woman of copper and steel lay scattered still, her form reduced to hundreds of panels, ribs, and beams. The challenge now was to transform this massive, intricate puzzle into the towering symbol that France had promised and America had dreamed of. The reassembly was entrusted to a team of experienced ironworkers and carpenters, many of whom had worked on the city's new suspension bridges and emerging skyscrapers. The statue's internal skeleton, designed by Alexandre Gustave Eiffel, was an engineering marvel in its own right, a network of wrought iron supports, crossbeams, and flexible trusses that would allow the copper skin to move slightly in the wind without tearing apart. Eiffel himself had sent detailed instructions with the statue shipment, diagrams that marked every joint, rivet, and beam. Yet when the foreman opened the crates, they quickly realized that something was wrong. Several key components were missing, not large enough to halt construction immediately, but important enough to raise concern. The first to vanish was small but specialized fittings, iron brackets custom forged in Paris to connect the copper sheets to the skeleton. At first, the crew assumed they had been misplaced in the confusion of unloading. But as days passed and more parts failed to turn up, the whispers began. Some blamed overworked dockhands who had lost track of the crates. Others suspected theft, pointing out that these fittings were made from a high-grade alloy valuable on the black market. Then there were the stranger rumors. An older laborer claimed he had seen two men in fine coats boarding a barge at night, carrying wooden boxes marked with the French shipping seal. They weren't workmen, he insisted, nor customs officials. Their faces were hidden under wide-brimmed hats, and they moved with the quiet efficiency of men who did not want to be noticed. Bartholdi was furious when he heard these accounts, but he ordered the work to proceed. Replacement parts could be fabricated in New York, though it would delay the schedule and strain the already tight budget. For him, the priority was to see the statue rise before the year's end. The process began with the iron skeleton. Work crews erected towering scaffolds around the pedestal, their wooden frames creaking under the weight of men and equipment. Beams were hoisted by steam-powered cranes, swung into place with precision, and fixed together with bolts and rivets. The skeleton rose in stages, each level braced before the next was begun. From a distance, it resembled the framework of some strange mechanical tower. Once the skeleton's lower structure was in place, the copper plates began to arrive. These were thin sheets, barely more than a few millimeters thick, but each was curved and shaped to form part of Liberty's flowing robes, her face, or her crown. Riveters and metalworkers clambered along the scaffolding, aligning the plates to the ribs, hammering them into place, and sealing the seams. Working at such heights was dangerous. The wind off the harbor could knock a man off balance in an instant. The inauguration and the whispered warnings. October 28, 1886, dawned with a crisp, clear sky over New York Harbor. From the early hours, ferries and private boats filled the waters around Bedloe's Island, their decks crowded with people eager to witness history. The streets of Manhattan were alive with excitement. Flags hung from windows, bands marched through the avenues, and the sound of cannon fire echoed from Fort Hamilton to Governor's Island. For weeks, newspapers had proclaimed the dedication of the Statue of Liberty as the grandest public celebration in the city's history. It was more than the unveiling of a monument. It was the declaration of a new national identity, a symbol of friendship between France and the United States, and, for many immigrants arriving at the port, a promise of hope and freedom. President Grover Cleveland himself would preside over the ceremony. Invitations had been sent to dignitaries, military officers, foreign ambassadors, and the wealthiest families of New York. But thousands of ordinary citizens, lacking any official pass, gathered on the shoreline with spyglasses and binoculars, determined to catch at least a glimpse of the colossal figure that now dominated the harbor. Yet behind the grand preparations, a shadow lingered. The missing components from the statue's construction had never been found. The odd indentation near the crown remained unexplained. A handful of workers, dismissed for dereliction of duty, claimed in hushed tones that certain internal passages had been altered in ways that did not match Eiffel's blueprints. Most dismissed these claims as bitterness from unemployed laborists, but for Bartholdi, they gnawed at the edges of an otherwise triumphant day. The ceremony began shortly after noon. Warships from both nations anchored nearby, their decks manned with sailors in full dress uniform. A chorus of steam whistles from the harbor's ferries joined the booming salute of artillery. On the island's platform, President Cleveland, tall and imposing, stepped forward to address the crowd. "We will not forget," he declared, "that Liberty has here made her home, nor shall her chosen altar be neglected. Let the stream of light she sends forth be a constant reminder that Liberty enlightens the world." His words were met with cheers from the assembled guests and the thunder of cannons firing in salute. At the signal, Bartholdi himself pulled the rope that released the French tricolour draped over the statue's face. The cloth billowed for a moment in the wind before falling away to reveal Liberty in her full glory. Sunlight struck her copper surface, casting a warm, golden gleam that momentarily silenced the crowd. From a distance, she was magnificent, tall, serene, resolute. But those close enough to see her details noticed faint variations in the copper's texture. places where the seams between panels were finer or coarser than the rest. A French engineer present at the ceremony frowned slightly, murmuring to a colleague that the pattern of rivets along her right arm was not exactly as we had made it. The official program proceeded with music, speeches, and military parades. But among the workers who had labored for months on the pedestal and statue, quiet exchanges passed from man to man. Some said there was a chamber inside the torch that did not exist on the original plans. Others claimed they had seen unfamiliar men entering the statue late at night in the final days before the scaffolding was removed. One laborer, a riveter named Thomas Keane, swore that he had been ordered to seal a panel inside the crown without asking questions. When he had peered through the gap before closing it, he saw what looked like a small, locked metal box bolted to the inner framework. It bore no label, and the foreman told him only that "It's none of your business, lad, just close it up." Keane's story might have been dismissed as tavern gossip, were it not for the fact that 3 other men recalled similar orders involving sealed compartments. Each time, the instructions came from someone outside the official construction hierarchy. No one could say who these individuals were, only that they seemed to have authority, and that their accents were neither purely French nor distinctly American. By evening, the crowds began to thin, though the statue's torch still blazed with the light of electric lamps, a marvel in itself at the time. From the ferries returning to Manhattan, Liberty appeared to float above the harbor, her flames steady against the night sky. But far from the celebrations, on the quieter docks of Brooklyn, a different meeting took place. 2 men, one wearing a long dark coat, the other carrying a leather-bound ledger, spoke in low tones beside a warehouse. The ledger was opened briefly, revealing a list of coded entries. One of the men tapped a line near the bottom, nodded, and closed the book. Without another word, they disappeared into the night. In the weeks that followed, the public's fascination with the statue only grew. Immigrants arriving through the harbor spoke of the or they felt when they first saw her. Newspapers printed illustrations and poems praising her grandeur. Yet, for those who had been part of the construction, the image was more complicated. They knew the official narrative, but they also carried with them unanswered questions. Bartholdi returned to France shortly after the dedication. To his friends and family, he spoke proudly of his creation. But in his private journal, later discovered among his papers, he recorded a brief but telling line: "Some parts of Liberty are not my own." The meaning of this entry has been debated by historians for over a century. Was it an artistic expression of the collaborative nature of the project? Or was it a cryptic acknowledgement that the statue had been altered without his consent? Whatever the truth, those alterations would remain hidden for decades. The great lady of the harbor stood watch through storms and sunshine, wars and peace, her secrets locked within her copper skin. But in time, events would conspire to draw attention once again to the spaces inside her, and to what, or who, they might contain. The revelation beneath the flame. By the early 20th century, the Statue of Liberty had already become an icon. Millions of immigrants passed under her gaze as they arrived through Ellis Island. Photographs, postcards, and souvenirs carried her image across the world. Yet to most, she was simply a monument, a majestic work of art and engineering. But in the autumn of 1916, her calm, copper face would bear silent witness to an event that would stir the waters of New York Harbor in more ways than one. That summer, America was still officially neutral in the Great War raging in Europe. Yet whispers of espionage and sabotage drifted through the port like an autumn fog. German agents were known to be operating in the city, targeting factories and shipping lines supplying the Allies. On July 30th, a massive explosion tore through Black Tom Island, a munitions depot in Jersey City, shattering windows in Manhattan and damaging the Statue of Liberty herself. The torch, once accessible to visitors, was closed permanently after the blast. Officially, the damage was structural, and repairs would be costly. But within the National Park Archives, sealed reports tell a slightly different story. According to one document marked Eyes Only, when engineers entered the torch to assess the damage, they discovered an unexpected cavity within the structure, a space that did not match any existing blueprints, not even Eiffel's meticulous designs. Inside this cavity was a corroded metal container, bolted to the frame. It bore the same strange, unmarked design that riveter Thomas Keane had described 30 years earlier. The container was pried loose and removed under strict secrecy. The report notes that it was delivered to federal authorities and provides no further details about its contents. The mystery deepened in the years that followed. In 1924, the statue was designated a national monument, and maintenance crews periodically worked inside her framework. Several of them reported finding unusual inscriptions etched into the copper skin, tiny symbols that did not correspond to any known construction marks. Some resembled ancient Mediterranean glyphs, others seemed almost mechanical in nature. By the 1940s, with the Second World War underway, the statue once again stood as a potent symbol of freedom. But war also brought heightened security. In 1942, during a routine inspection, a maintenance worker named Samuel Harris stumbled upon a hidden latch behind one of the torch support beams. With the help of a fellow worker, he pried it open to reveal a narrow, vertical shaft leading deep into the pedestal. At the bottom of the shaft was a locked iron door. No key could be found, and when they reported it to their supervisor, they were told it was an old access hatch no longer in use. Yet according to Harris's private notes, discovered after his death in 1978, the door had faint vibrations, as if some machine or current was operating behind it. The National Park Service denied any such feature existed. Still, in the 1950s, when new lighting was installed for the statue, electrical workers noticed that certain conduits inside the pedestal led nowhere, or rather, they disappeared into sealed compartments. Some suspected it was leftover infrastructure from abandoned projects. Others, more curious, wondered if the statue's original builders had embedded something inside her, a device, perhaps, or a message meant for a future generation. By the 1980s, the statue was in need of major restoration. Corrosion had eaten away at parts of her iron skeleton, and the entire structure was carefully dismantled and repaired. This restoration provided the most complete internal examination since her construction. It was during this time that workers uncovered a series of hidden copper plates tucked between the layers of her robes. The plates were engraved with both French and English text, but in a cipher that resisted all attempts at translation. Linguists, cryptographers, and historians pored over photographs of the engravings, but the code remained unbroken. One expert in historical ciphers noted that the structure of the text was unlike anything from the 19th century, more akin to encryption methods developed in the mid-20th century. This raised an unsettling question. How could an encryption style from decades later appear in an object sealed since the 1880s? During the restoration, a small group of workers claimed that, late one night, several men in plain clothes arrived on the site and removed 3 of the copper plates without explanation. The official project records list only miscellaneous scrap removed for disposal, but the workers swore the plates were taken intact. And then, in 2001, something remarkable happened. In the days after the September 11th attacks, when the statue was closed to the public for security reasons, a team of federal agents conducted an unscheduled inspection of the monument. The reason for this inspection was never publicly explained, but internal maintenance logs show that they spent nearly 6 hours in the upper levels of the torch, despite the area being closed for decades. A retired park ranger, speaking anonymously, claimed that the agents emerged carrying a weathered, leather-bound portfolio. Inside, he said, were sketches of the statue's interior, not as it was built, but as if it contained additional chambers and mechanisms unknown to the public or official blueprints. The ranger also claimed to have overheard one agent say, "It's still intact." They never found the others. If true, this would suggest that the Statue of Liberty houses more than symbolic meaning, that it contains hidden artifacts or technology placed there deliberately, perhaps even before her arrival in New York. Some theorists point to the peculiar fact that the statue's official title, Liberty Enlightening the World, could be interpreted literally, that she was meant to enlighten in ways beyond metaphor. The torch, after all, is a beacon, and some believe it was designed to emit more than just visible light. In recent years, thermal imaging of the statue, conducted during maintenance, has revealed irregular heat patterns inside the torch and crown, inconsistent with normal environmental heating. Engineers attribute this to insulation and structural quirks, but for others, it's proof of some internal system still operating after more than a century. Today, as she continues to stand watch over New York Harbor, the Statue of Liberty remains both a symbol and a mystery. Her copper skin, weathered to a soft green, hides countless stories, some celebrated, others buried deep within her framework. Perhaps one day, the hidden compartments will be opened, the cryptic engravings deciphered, and the truth of what Bartholdi meant when he wrote "Some parts of liberty are not my own" will be revealed. Until then, she stands silent, holding her torch high, not just for the tired, the poor, and the huddled masses yearning to breathe free, but perhaps also for those waiting for the day her other purpose will be known. As the last waves brush against the Manhattan shore and the harbor lights fade into the mist, the story of the Statue of Liberty sinks once more into the shadows, where it has quietly lived for centuries. What you've just heard is only a fragment of what history never meant to tell. But these secrets, they never truly disappear. Remember, every statue, every monument, every piece of etched metal carries a soul. And sometimes, if you listen long enough, you can hear the whispers of the past. If you wish to keep walking through the world of untold stories, subscribe, like, and share this video, because this is only the beginning.